You can't say that there is a good Talib and a bad Talib, because at the end of the day, they will turn against you and us. At the end of the day, they may be useful to you today, but history has proven, and I think we don't want to prove this in the future, that they will turn and bite the hand that feeds them. That is part of their mindset. That is part of their ideology. That is part of their belief system. So if you can't differentiate between the good and bad, you are playing with fire. And so that is the message that we have been giving to our neighbors and anyone who feels that this guy is good and that guy is bad, and this guy I can use today and the other guy I can discard the next day. As far as consequences are concerned, for Pakistan, I mean, I'm not the person who can decide on or who can discuss that, but I think we have reached a point in Western thinking, and especially as far as political circles are concerned, that realize that the last 16 years were somewhat wasted, that there was so much destruction and loss of life with nothing tangible as a result. And so, yes, you can call it duplicity, you can call it double game, you can call it strategic, gaming, you can call it strategic depth, as some people call it, using Afghanistan vis-a-vis India and the whole, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan triangle that people talk about. But we feel that there are changes taking place in how, in the expectations that the world has of Pakistan. Now, I don't know if Pakistan agrees or Pakistan realizes what this could mean or what it means. There are forces in Pakistan that think that they can withstand any type of pressure, and there are others who are concerned. There's a democratic Pakistan that is very worried about its future and about the future of that country. And so I hope that Pakistan will come to a realization that the policies of the last 25 years of trying to use the Taliban as a proxy force to manage Afghanistan's affairs has failed. It has been a failure. And if it has been a failure, it means that it's time to rethink it. It's time to re-strategize. And it's time to work with everyone to make sure that we come up with the right solution for ourselves and for our people in our nations. So I hope that that message is clear, but I think time will tell whether that message has been absorbed.
Thank you. So what I'm going to do now is just take, I know there are a lot of questions on this side. I'm going to take one more now, and then we will go to Dr. Dawud Azami's 15-minute contribution, and then I think there's probably time for a coffee break, and then we'll have the Professor giving his remarks as well. I'll just say to you, if you've got questions, there will be, I promise you, a chance with the whole panel to ask them. But let's just do one more now. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Adil Sultan from King's College. Thank you, Excellency, for a very objective assessment of yours about Afghanistan's situation. I recognize you mentioned that there are a number of countries in which the Taliban have the sanctuaries. And I also recognize you mentioned Pakistan and Iran. Are there any more countries? And if you can be specific about these countries, can you name them? Thank you.
So yes. So Pakistan has, I think everybody recognizes after all these years that Pakistan has been the main sanctuary for Taliban and has offered safe havens. And I mentioned the fact that these safe havens are multi-layered. It's an infrastructure that has been put in place over the last 25 years that has, they think, served them well. We think hasn't served them or anybody well. But, there's a layer that touches the madrasa system. the madrasa system that was put in place in the 1980s with Saudi funding and Wahhabi assistance and so on and so forth, that Pakistan has been trying to use on two fronts. Part of them with India, and the other part with Afghanistan. And these policies, by the way, are all policies that have nothing to do with the Pakistani civilian government. These are policies that are totally controlled by the military, from A to Z. So the safe havens, there's madrasa system, there's the training, recruitment, there's the financial and funding part, which goes beyond just Pakistan and Afghanistan. For all these years, money has been brought in from many other parts of the Islamic world where people believe in that kind of sort of agenda. And then there's the drug and narcotics and criminality nexus, which includes smuggling and making sure that they profit from these funding sources. So when I talk about the infrastructure, I'm talking about this whole thing. The main part of it has been, unfortunately, in Pakistan. And it has hurt Pakistan as well. Where did the TTP come from? The TTP is an offshoot of the Afghan Taliban, and then it got splintered into groups that were pro-state and anti-state. Some were used for one reason, some were used for another reason over these years. The part that has to do with Iran is very new, is not the same structure as the one that exists in Pakistan. It is mostly contacts that take place at the sort of intelligence level. I'm not even sure if the Iranian government per se is fully aware of what it means, but there's definitely a part of the Iranian regime that has been involved. And it's troubling, as I said, because they are using it as part of their hedging policy. And it has evolved as a result of Daesh and Islamic State becoming a threat to Iranian interests in the Middle East and in the countries surrounding Iran. So that particular structure and what the Taliban have been able to invest and how the Iranians are using that for their own purposes is something that is new. It's not as deep-rooted, but nonetheless, it's troubling for everyone. And I think that there's a cure for that, and I think that it can be resolved, as I said earlier, through other channels, and making sure that they understand that Afghanistan is as much of a victim of Daesh as it is of Taliban and other terrorist groups, including Al-Qaeda, which still exists in our region. So the Afghan message for them is, let's share whatever information we have, let's cooperate in making sure that Daesh does not find a foothold, and more importantly, let's not be misconceived about this narrative, which is a conspiracy theory narrative that says that the Daesh that exists in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region is an American fabrication. It's a Western fabrication, and that it's used solely to threaten Russian and Iranian interests and maybe Chinese interests. I think that we need to unravel this conspiracy theory, and it can be done. It just needs some effort. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you very much indeed. So, as I say, we will be having a much longer Q&A session, thank you very much, towards the at the end of the afternoon's talks. And so before we have our coffee break, as I say, Dr. Emily Winterbottom is not with us, so we're just sort of rescheduling ourselves. We're just about getting back on track. And I think if before coffee, Dr. Dawud Azami makes his remarks, and then we'll break and move on. So I should say you've got enough degrees to run this yourself in every aspect. He's got 3 masters, 3 bachelor degrees, and a PhD, and is very active in the BBC as well, and was in charge in Kabul for the BBC for a period there, 2010-11, I think. So, Doctor, why don't you tell us your remarks, and you've got the microphone.
Thank you very much, Owen, for your kind introduction, and I would like to thank the Democracy Forum for inviting me, and especially Mr. Deegan for organizing this event. I will talk briefly about the strategy itself and the regional challenges and opportunities. So first of all, as you heard, more troops have been sent to Afghanistan as part of this strategy. Secondly, they have more freedom to conduct operations. I mean, they say that the US air power has been unleashed. They have been using new weapons, new aeroplanes. A couple of weeks ago, Americans used for the first time an F-22 bomber in Afghanistan. BP-52s are back, and in April, the first combat use of the mother of all bomb was also in Afghanistan. So this is all part of the new strategy. And pressure on Pakistan is also part of it, and the public condemnation of Pakistan by the US President in his strategy speech was also part of this strategy. So the speech itself, or criticism, was also part of this strategy. But we don't know what will be the end result. But the biggest challenge, I think, for this strategy is the regional rivalries and US's tension with many regional countries. So that's where the biggest challenge lies. Many regional countries have reservations about US's new Afghan strategy. The US calls it a strategy for Afghanistan and South Asia, but basically it's about 3 countries, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, the so-called Deadly Triangle. Nearly all neighbors and near neighbors are against the long-term US presence in Afghanistan. So they have publicly talked about this. Russia, Iran, China, and Pakistan are all against the permanent US bases in Afghanistan or long-term US presence there. So secondly, some of these countries have been accused of having contacts or ties with the Afghan Taliban, particularly Pakistan, Iran, and Russia. I mean, you have heard Pakistan has been accused for a long time for supporting the Taliban or having links and contacts with the Afghan Taliban. But in the past 2 or 3 years, Iran has been accused regularly by US forces and US officials and some Afghan officials. But over the past 1 year, Russia has been the target of such criticism. Many US officials have blamed Russians for arming the Taliban, not only supporting them financially. And some Afghan officials have also said similar things, but we haven't seen any evidence of that. But in turn, Russia is accusing the US for supporting a group called Daesh in Afghanistan. I mean, it's part of a blame game, which is the mother of all problems. So that's the main problem. And without the support of the region, especially these key players, so it'll be challenging to reach the intended goal. But when it comes to Pakistan, Pakistan has been accused of so many things. It has been criticized after the election of Trump, and many US officials have had very harsh words for Pakistan. Many of them have visited Pakistan, and a couple of high-ranking officials are going back to Pakistan in the next 2 weeks. Mattis and Dunford will visit Pakistan in the next 2 weeks. But we haven't seen any progress. Nothing, it seems, has been changed since the strategy was announced. Afghan officials and American officials have told us that they haven't seen any change in Pakistani behavior. So far, from the US side, it has been mainly words and criticism. So we haven't seen any action on part of the US against Pakistan or any sort of pressure. So it will take a lot of time, I guess, especially over the winter. We might see something tangible. But a couple of things have happened since the strategy was announced. First, the Canadian-American couple, which was recovered in Pakistan, was after this strategy was announced. So President Trump, in his usual way tweeted and praised Pakistan for its cooperation in the recovery of this couple and their kids. Second was the meeting of the quadrilateral contact group between Pakistan, America, Afghanistan, and the US in Qatar last month. So this was also kind of a progress after the strategy. But apart from these two events, we haven't seen any tangible progress. When it comes to Iran, I mean, you have heard Iran has been accused of having links with the Afghan Taliban, and there are reports that Iran is supporting the Afghan Taliban. Some Afghan officials have accused Iranian officials of having links with the Afghan Taliban. But again, we don't have any evidence. It is mainly the local officials in the provinces, not in the center. So Kabul has been mainly quite the central government. But local officials in the provinces have been accusing Iran for having links with the Taliban. We have also heard that some of the Taliban leaders have moved to Iran. You remember the story of Mullah Mansour, Akhtar Muhammad Mansour, who was killed in a US drone attack in Balochistan last year. So the reports were that he was coming back to Pakistan from Iran. So there are movements on that front as well. And by the way, Russian and Iranian officials have publicly acknowledged that we have contacts with the Taliban, we have ties with the Afghan Taliban. But they say that we are not arming them, we are not financing them. These contacts are mainly for the Afghan peace process. We are encouraging them to take part in the political process. But we know their main concern is Daesh, the emergence of Daesh in Afghanistan. Daesh, as you know, Daesh in Afghanistan, Pakistan region is an offshoot of the Daesh in Iran and Syria. It has been active in Afghanistan since January 2016, mainly in the east of Afghanistan. So these countries have been accusing each other of supporting this group. I'll give you just two examples which will make it easier how deep this mistrust is. Drugs and Daesh are seen as problems for all the countries in South and Central Asia. So they all agree they are bad for all of us. I mean, they have different definitions of proxy and terrorism and the rest of it. But when it comes to these two problems, drugs and Daesh, all of them say that, yes, this is a threat, this is an enemy. But they are not on the same page even on these issues. When it comes to Daesh, there are many conspiracy theories, many suspicions. Russia and Iran are seeing the group called Daesh as a US proxy. This is what they have said publicly. Pakistan says, or some Pakistani officials say, there is a raw NDS construct. Afghan and Indian officials see it as another Pakistani proxy. So even they are not on the same page on this big issue, which is seen by all of them as a serious threat. And the same is the case with drugs. Tension with U.S. tension with Iran or U.S. hostility towards Iran will also have many negative ripple effects. So it's not only tension with Pakistan, Iran is also important to watch. U.S.-Russia tensions are also important for the stability or instability of Afghanistan. If tensions are increasing, we all know that Russia has a lot of influence in Afghanistan. They not only have contacts with Afghan Taliban, they have contacts with other important players in Afghanistan. So they have the potential to create problems for the Afghan government and the U.S. So this is the regional challenge that we are talking about. But we all know that the problem in Afghanistan is cannot be solved by one country. It's a regional problem, it's an international problem. So one country, even the US, doesn't have the capacity to sort out Afghanistan. It needs the cooperation of all the important players in the region, because the issue or the conflict has been becoming more complicated. Like 2 years ago, we didn't have Daesh in Afghanistan-Pakistan region. Now there is Daesh. Recently, new groups are emerging like Fatimiyun militia and Zainabiyun militia, which were trained by Iran and fought in Syria and Iraq. So they are coming back to the region. So this is taking shape as another group. So the number of non-state actors and groups, in addition to organized crime, is increasing. And so is the tension between US and regional countries and rivalries among regional players. So India-China tension, India-Pakistan rivalry. So this will also have an impact on the situation in Afghanistan. So the challenge for the US is to bring all these important players on the same page. And the bigger challenge for the Afghan government is to balance its foreign policy because there are conflicting interests. So these are the main challenges that I think will have big implications for the success of the US strategy for Afghanistan and South Asia.
Thank you very much indeed. And we've just got 5 minutes for the coffee break, so I will just take 2 or 3 questions. I think I should go to this side of the room. Here is the microphone, if someone could help me again. Thank you very much. And we'll just run this up to 1:15. Here we go. Yes, that gentleman with his hand up there, yes.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Karim Shirin from the Afghan Association of London. I have 2 questions, if I can, from Mr. Samad. Recently, 2 of your former bosses are very important political figures in Afghanistan. One is Mr. Karzai, very serious and extreme revelation recently about the policy and the United States commitment on war of terrorism in Afghanistan. What he says that United States never been for the interests of the Afghanistan, and he said that Daesh and other extremes been increased under the watch of the United States, and such more revelation recently. And one of your former boss, in the foreign ministry, as I have knowledge that you work in the foreign ministry for a very long time, Mr. Spanta revealed in his book recently that the United States senior diplomat once said in his presence to the President Karzai that we need Pakistan 100 times more than Afghanistan. So we never take action against Pakistan. I just want to know, do you buy these facts and revelation? If not, why? And the second short question, any such policy need a very strong and stable government in Afghanistan, without which cannot be implemented, any policy cannot be implemented. With the government that we have now in Afghanistan, where the vice president is in exile, accused of sexual harassment, we have the parliament fighting within themselves. We have the government that not been appointed more than half of the cabinet yet after all the 3 years of their government. And we have the governor in very important province in northern Afghanistan that openly challenging the government. How we can implement such policies such as this one in such a fragile government? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to ask both of you to comment on that. Why don't you start off, Ambassador, and then I'll ask Dr. Zahn to do so as well.
Thank you. Mr. Karzai's views and remarks over the years have been at best controversial and have raised a lot of questions in Afghanistan itself, aside from questions that it has raised outside. For the record, I resigned from Mr. Karzai's government in 2009 because, 2011, because of such views, because of the fact that I saw him sort of vacillating between positions and not having a straightforward, concrete policy on what is good for the country and how to deal with the major issues that Afghanistan faced. So he was my boss for a while, but I was probably one of the very first ones to resign. So his views on Daesh are I don't find his views on Daesh and the threats that Afghanistan faces today as being well-founded. I think that they are mostly influenced by conspiracy theories and by what he considers as being politically expedient for himself in his interest. As far as Mr. Spantor's views are concerned and what he has written in his book lately, I have not read his book yet, but I have read other people's opinion and excerpts of his book, and what he quotes as an American official as having said to him and to Mr. Karzai. I mean, I cannot dispute it, agree or not agree. It's a quote that he uses. Whether Pakistan is more important or less important is not an issue right now. Well, I think what is the issue is the fact that we need to tackle terrorism and extremism that fuels it once and for all. We need to take measures to combat it effectively. Whether one country is more important or less important is irrelevant. As far as the fragility of the current government is concerned and the political situation inside Afghanistan and how it impacts or how it is impacted by the new U.S. policy, if I haven't misread your question, yes, there is fragility. Afghanistan has been fragile from 2001. But at the same time, I think that there is also a lot of resilience amongst the Afghan people. I think that the Afghan people know that at a certain point they need to make sure that fragility does not turn into political collapse or instability. I think that they really hope for an inclusive, representative government and better governance and less corruption and a more representative government and legitimacy. I think these are some of the main drivers of the Afghan population's desires and wants. They are fed up with the war, but they're also fed up with how government is dealing with their immediate issues as well as the larger issues that the country faces. I have a lot of trust in the Afghan people. I may have much less trust in the Afghan political elites, but I think that at the end of the day, the Afghan people will make the right decision.
So I'll talk briefly about Daesh. Daesh, I mean, people in Afghanistan and outside Afghanistan have accused countries and blame them for supporting Daesh group. But as I said earlier, it's part of the larger blame game. Russia has been accusing the US of using unmarked helicopters and supplying weapons to Daesh groups in Afghanistan, but we haven't seen any evidence. On the other hand, US has been accusing Russia for supplying the Taliban, but again, we haven't seen any evidence. So I think it's largely about the blame game. And this is when mistrust and suspicion comes. And when it comes to Taliban and their links with other countries, I think until a few years ago, they were feeling isolated, but now they feel emboldened because they have established links with other countries in the region and outside the region, especially after the emergence of Daesh. I mean, Daesh, in a way, challenged the Taliban. They fought against each other and killed hundreds of people from both sides. But it was a blessing in disguise for the Taliban, because other countries came and approached the Taliban, and they changed their policy of non-interaction with the Taliban. So the links that Russia or Iran has with the Taliban today are also mainly due to Daesh, because Taliban are fighting against Daesh group in Afghanistan, and Russia didn't want this group to go towards Central Asia and destabilize Central Asian countries and eventually Russia. and the same is the case with Iran. It didn't want to be threatened by Daesh on both sides, on western border and eastern border. There was Daesh in Iraq, and then they couldn't afford another Daesh in Afghanistan. So that's why they established links with the Taliban, and Taliban have assured all these countries that one, our agenda is local, we don't fight outside the borders of Afghanistan, and second, we wouldn't allow Daesh to threaten your security and stability. So that was the kind of deal that they have discussed. But as I said earlier, there are conspiracy theories. It's a very chaotic situation. There are many known unknowns and unknown unknowns. Nobody knows who is doing what. It's a war of ghosts or shadows. So that's where the complexity comes of this problem. And that's why all these countries need a sincere dialogue and cooperation to stabilize not only Afghanistan but the whole region. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed. We'll take a break now as it's scheduled on the programme, and I'd ask you all to come back after this very interesting open session. We'll be back at 3:35.
Your name, but if you kindly speak it out so it will go to my editor straight.
So, what do you want me to say?
If you first give me your name.
Just my name?
Yeah.
Dawood Azami.
Okay. Basically, whatever you said is fantastic. Just if you kindly encompass your thoughts about what you said, or the essence of what you said, I'll be grateful.
So there are two major challenges for the US's new strategy for Afghanistan and South Asia. One is US's tension with many important regional players. US has tensions with Pakistan. There are tensions between America and Russia. There are tensions between America and Iran. So if these countries are not cooperating with the US to implement its new strategy, it will be very difficult and challenging for the US to achieve its goal, mainly to stabilize Afghanistan and the wider region. Second, the number of non-state actors in that region is very large. There are Taliban, Pakistani Taliban, Afghan Taliban, there's Al-Qaeda, and now until 2 years ago there was no Daesh. Now there is ISIS or Daesh group. And we are seeing new groups, for example, the militias which were supported by Iran in Syria, they are mainly from Pakistan, Iraq and Afghanistan. So the Pakistani and Afghan groups are coming back to their countries. So it's becoming another player which is well-trained and highly ideological militia group. And thirdly, it'll be also difficult for the Afghan government to balance all these conflicting interests in the region. There are so many rivalries between regional players. There is tension between India and Pakistan. There are tensions between India and China, which will have a negative impact on the situation in Afghanistan. And there are already tensions between Afghanistan and Pakistan. So these are the tensions which have created a sort of blame game, which is the mother of all problems. So unless there is cooperation and sincere dialogue between all these important players, it is not possible to sort out the problem in Afghanistan and the wider region, because the problems are not confined to one country, and one country alone cannot solve these problems. It's a regional problem, it's an international problem. Even the US on its own cannot resolve these issues. So there is a need for cooperation and collaboration among the regional players and international players to stabilize Afghanistan and the wider region.
Doctor, thank you so much. Very kind.
Regathered. I can see just a couple more coming in. So let me introduce Professor Thomas Johnson. And I should say, I was going to plug his magnificent book on Taliban messaging and the like, with a view to encouraging maybe some of you to purchase it from the stall outside, which I'm told will be disappeared by the time that this session is over. So you'll have to get it on Amazon. But this is Taliban Narratives, an analysis of how the Taliban have not gone for hearts and minds, but trust and confidence. And maybe the professor will talk about that as well. He's based at the Naval Postgraduate School at Monterey in California. He teaches on Afghanistan, Central Asia, politics, terrorism, security, and has taught at the University of Southern California. He'll be talking today on President Trump's new Afghan strategy, shifting the deck chairs on the Afghan Titanic, giving a hint of where he's coming from. So let's have this talk now, and then we'll be opening up to questions for the professor, and if you'd like to direct some of the people who didn't get a chance earlier to the panel as a whole, that will be fine, wrapping up at around 5 o'clock. So, Professor, here is the microphone, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, I'd like to especially thank Lord Bruce, Mr. Singh, and Tom Deegan, and the entire Democracy Forum staff for inviting me to participate with this outstanding panel at this very important forum. And let me start out by saying that the words that I speak today are all my own. They don't represent my university. They surely don't represent the United States government, and they surely don't represent Donald Trump. What I plan to do today is to talk about the explicit question that was raised by the forum on cross-border terrorism and the implications of Trump's plan. Trump does not have a strategy because there's no end game, and I don't think Trump understands what a strategy is. But in discussing that issue, I plan to discuss basically 4 other things. I plan to start out by talking about the present Afghan situation. Then I plan to talk about Trump's quote plan and a couple of key things that he said during his speech that I think are provocative and deserve attention. Then I plan to talk about the cross-border problem, and of course, associated with that, the key issue, Pakistan. And I'm going to end up talking about future issues that I think that we all should keep our eyes out for in Afghanistan. And let me start by suggesting that the first thing that I say to my students in both my introductory and my advanced Afghan seminars is that the only truism about Afghanistan is there's no truths. That's to suggest that what works in one Calais or village or in one district or in one province or one city might not work in the neighboring village, the neighboring province, the neighboring district. So I'm going to necessarily speak in generalities today, but maybe during the questions and the answers I can get more nuanced, because everything I say today has an exception because of the multi-layered aspect of Afghanistan, and it's a very complex country. But before explicitly addressing the question as to will the new US-Afghan, quote, policy stop cross-border terror, by the way, the answer to that question relative to me is a very, very big no. I have a number of other issues that I'd like to address that impact on the answer. And as you'll see, a major part of the ultimate answer to this question the forum asks involves provocative questions, especially relative to Pakistan and their total duplicity since 9/11. Let me set the context of my remarks by addressing how and why the war in Afghanistan has become a quagmire that is, I believe, is unwinnable without significant strategy changes, not minor policy changes. I would usually spend an entire academic quarter addressing this issue with my students, and I obviously don't have that much time, so I'm going to speak in some gross generalities. But let me start out by saying what I think the major problem in Afghanistan was, and continues to be in a certain extent, and I address it thoroughly in my book, my newest book. America and NATO basically went into Afghanistan with an extremely naive, if not basic, misunderstanding of what Afghanistan was all about. They had a very good idea about what the Kabulis wanted, but they never really answered or asked the rural Afghans that make up 80% of the population what they wanted. And, you know, in Clausewitzian terms, that was the center of gravity in Afghanistan. So our general lack of knowledge of understanding the nuances and the multi-layers, especially in rural Afghanistan, from day one, I believe, damned our engagement. and has surely plagued us ever since October 2001 and our long occupation in the country. And also a major issue which my distinguished guests have also addressed, but I want to give a specific example, is continuing government illegitimacy and massive corruption. Now, I published an article a long time ago after the first Walsey-Jurga elections in 2005, and I have an article coming out of Cambridge University, the Press Small Wars and Insurgency on the 2010 Walsey-Jurga election. And Afghanistan has a totally broken electoral system. And let me give you an example. An analysis of the Kabul voting in the last Walsey-Jurga election in 2010, there were 664 candidates running for 33 Walsey-Jurga seats. Okay, now remember that there aren't Walsey-Jurga districts, so a person in Kabul, in the Kabul province, would vote for one person for those, not 33, but one person for one Walsey-Jurga seat. So out of a total of 486,000 valid ballots that were cast, Haji Mohammed Mahakik was the leading vote getter. And he received a total of 3.6% of the vote. That's not a mistake. 3.6% of the vote. Now, can you imagine a member of parliament getting 3.6% of the vote? Can you imagine an American congressman getting 3.6% of the vote? But what's worse is this, that a mere 3.6% of the vote could represent the most popular candidate is disturbing and has serious implications relative to representative democracy in Afghanistan. But overall, 21 of the 33 candidates that were elected to the Walsey-Jurga because of the single non-transferable vote that's being used in Afghanistan, 64% received less than 1% of the vote. So do you wonder why there are legislative problems between the executive branch and the legislature? Because the legislature, the lower house, the Walsey-Jurga, has no constituency. When 3.2% of the vote is the largest vote getter in the largest province, there's obviously a major problem. And this is a problem that has to be addressed in the future. And fortunately, I'm working with some Afghans right now through the Afghan Strategic Study Institute in Herat to hopefully get rid of the SNTLV. But I have my own conspiracies why it's lasted this long, if you want me to talk about it in the question and answer period. But let me talk about some other problems facing Afghanistan presently. The Afghan population, quite frankly, has not been secured. The Taliban right now are the strongest since they've been since 2001. Taliban insurgents, wrapped in the narrative of jihad, now control more land and form of districts since any time in 2001. Of the 407 districts in Afghanistan, 34 of the 34 provinces, only 231 are under government control or influence as late as August of this year. 54 districts are either under insurgent, explicit control or influence. And that's something that we have to remember. The situation is not rosy in Afghanistan. The insurgents, Taliban, continue to stage assaults on key urban centers and provincial capitals. As mentioned earlier, they haven't been able to keep Kunduz, but Lashkar-Gah almost fell and probably would have fallen if 400 U.S. Marines weren't sent there 4 months ago. What the Taliban are basically doing right now, and not the Haqqani network, but others, they're not really interested in the casualties in their urban attacks. What they're saying to the Afghan population is that we can do anything when we want to do it, and there's nothing you can do about it. And the Afghan National Security Forces have not been able to stop them. The next point I want to suggest is that violence is so bad in parts of Afghanistan right now, you might have read last week that the Red Cross clinics are shutting all of their doors in the country. Now, they did this once before in 2008, so this is a very bad sign. I think that the Afghan national security, and again, this is generalization, there are some very good units, some of the special forces are very good, but on a whole, I think they're basically useless. And I think that they aren't very competent. And the Afghan National Police Force is a net security negative. They're an extractive organization that's one of the most hated institutions in many parts of the country. And I'll entertain questions on that if anybody wants to argue with me. In fact, 33% of the Afghan National Police have never even received any training. The extent of the capabilities, or should I say the lack of them, is one of the reasons why the U.S. is now looking at the absolutely disastrous policy of letting warlords back into the fight. If you read the Washington Post and the New York Times last week, Washington is now saying, let the warlords back into the fight, because we don't have the Afghan National Security Forces to be able to do it. And I think this is a drastic mistake, and it's going to increase the violence instead of decreasing the violence. The ANA probably has 75 to 85,000 men under arms. The statistics that come out of the United States and Kabul have been rubbish for years. In fact, the actual strength of the Afghan National Security